It sounds like a stupid question, why build fighters like the Bf-109 or the Focke-Wulf 190 as an air force? Of course it's to shoot stuff down. I totally get that. Don't judge too soon, however, because behind this question there is a lot of really fascinating information and reasons about how a country, in this case Nazi Germany, constructed a very specific force for its campaigns. And together we will explore those reasons to understand the Luftwaffe's early success and, looking to the future, also its downfall. Welcome to the Luftwaffe at War. This episode is sponsored by our friends at REC Watches, who have a brand new watch featuring the SR71. And this episode I will look at the Luftwaffe fighters. This time it's not going to be from the technical or the tactical perspective. I know that might disappoint some of you if you like the dogfights and the action, in which case just watch these episodes right here. But you know my content. I want to give you a grounded and very holistic understanding of air power and the Luftwaffe. Knowledge that helped me and hopefully helps you understand air power beyond the headline. And that's why for this episode I will tell you all you need to know about how the Germans plan to use their fighter aircraft on the big picture. And then in the future, yes, I'm absolutely going to take you on that journey with episodes on the individual aircraft, the tactics, the operations, and perhaps I'll even talk about the pilots at some point. But this episode sets the foundation for all of that. And talking of other episodes, supporters get upcoming episodes early and ad-free, can vote on topics, and have priority access to Q&As. Thanks to Alan, Keith, and Mark, who have recently signed up. The problem we have nowadays is that the air war of World War II over Europe is seen almost exclusively through the lens of the Allied combined bomber offensive and by extension the struggle between fighter pilots and bomber crews. That is only one part, and an important one, of the history, but it is also not the part that the Luftwaffe planned for. And why should it have? After all, what country actually starts a war with the plan to have its own postcodes comprehensively bombed into submission? No, countries start a war because they believe they can win and that the price they will pay is offset by the spoils they will gain. And for that, a country plans a campaign and designs a force that it believes will win. As you know from my opening episode on the Luftwaffe at War, the Luftwaffe has three overarching missions: engage and destroy the enemy air force, support army and navy operations, and strike both at the origins of power of the enemy military and its linkages to the front lines. And this brings me to audience participation question number one. Where do you think fighters fit in? Surely it is in the engage and destroy the enemy air force part. Nope. Actually, no, just no. Of course, the Luftwaffe was not under any illusions. Yes, in practical terms, the fighters were going to fight other air forces and their bombers, but this was not what they were built for. Remember my Luftwaffe bomber and Luftwaffe heavy fighter episode? Yes, exactly. Those were the planes that were meant to destroy other air forces. It wasn't the fighter. To understand this, ignore hindsight, ignore the combined bomber offensive, ignore even the aces and all those popular memories that we have. The answer lies in the big picture stuff on how the Luftwaffe wanted to construct its force and what the individual cogs in that force would do. And that brings me back to World War I and the interwar years. The Battle of Verdun 1916. To cover the German assault against the French fortresses, the German Fokker Eindeckers are massed into the first dedicated fighter units of the war. Armed with a single synchronized machine gun, they only have one mission: shoot down every single French aircraft they can find. And they are deadly effective, shooting down one French recon plane after the other. Soon the French have no ability to spot German movements or call in more accurate artillery strikes, allowing the Germans to advance much more rapidly than would have otherwise been possible. As a result, French General Pétain turns to the commander of aviation forces of the French Fifth Army, Charles Triconeau de Rose, and says, "Rose, je suis aveugle, balayez-moi le ciel. Rose, I am blind, clear me the sky." The resultant duel between the Fokker Eindeckers and Nieuport 11s is not just the first real air battle. It foreshadows the next 2 years of fighting and is still relevant to air power now, highlighting the importance of having air superiority over the critical operational areas on both land and sea in order to permit ground maneuver, striking enemy positions, and critically reconnaissance for better tactical and operational awareness. And talking of reconnaissance, there is strategic reconnaissance, and few planes ever did this as well as the legendary Lockheed SR71. And now you can own a piece of them with REC watches. They should be no strangers to you, as REC has previously made 2 different watches with parts from a Spitfire. And when you thought they couldn't up that, well, they did. Their newest watch design is inspired by the SR71, with the lower dial made out of titanium from the engines of the rare SR71B, number 617956, the invaluable trainer aircraft with a second cockpit to train pilots for operational sorties. After service with the Air Force, it was used by NASA and flew until 1997, logging more than 3,400 flight hours. That's more than any other SR71. The watch is currently on a pre-order discount and only limited numbers remain. And to make things even better, you get a further 10% off by applying my code MA on checkout. REC has of course sponsored previous videos on my channel going back to when they first stepped into the aviation game. I own one of their Spitfire watches and I wear it almost daily, and I can tell you it's really nice to have a piece of aviation history with me wherever I go. This is of course a premium good, but it really speaks to the aviation nerd inside of me, so check out the offer with the link in the description below. Now you will have noticed that during World War I, a lot of this is largely focused around a set operational area, and it is a duel between fighters in order to set the conditions to exploit air power. As the first experience in air warfare, World War I would leave a lasting impression on every single country. But very different lessons were learned. But all of them had one aim: use air power to make the next war more costly to the enemy, but less costly for yourself. At this point, I could very well start a long and complex discussion about the different air theories of the time. I have covered that ground before, and this episode is about the Luftwaffe, so let's stay on target here. What important lesson did the Luftwaffe learn from World War I in regards to fighters? I would argue that it is fairly simple. Air superiority and joint operations matter. Now, this is not rocket science nowadays, but if you compare the Luftwaffe of 1939 to 1941 to the Allied Air Forces, you will see a massive difference in how this lesson is reflected in real operational terms. At this point, let's briefly swing back to the bombers, mainly because of that popular image we have nowadays, which sadly clouds our understanding of the period before 1943 with a fair portion of hindsight-inspired wisdom. For much of the time until World War II, fighter versus bomber engagements are not as straightforward as they appear in our popular conception of World War II air combat, whether that be from books, movies, or video games. To understand this, we need to understand the logic of air theorists, force mix, and the technology base of the 1920s and 30s. Let's start with the first two there. To have a meaningful contribution in a war, theorists and air power supporters argued that an air force had to go somewhere and deliver munitions. It's that classic mix of air power fundamentals which we have, from reach, speed, height, concentration, and payloads. In the eyes of theorists, only the bomber could offer a way to strike en masse at range without having to bother with moving troops on a map. The bomber was thus seen as a or as the means to an end. It really depends on where in the air power theory spectrum somebody was at the time. Some people said bombers play a part, and others said that it was the only thing that was needed. Anyway, the respective end state was obviously victory to both of these takes. Hence why we have the saying, the bomber will always come through. Now that's from Stanley Baldwin's 1932 speech in the British Parliament. I seriously recommend reading the actual speech, as our contemporary understanding of it is very different to what Baldwin said. If I don't forget, I will add it to the show notes. Anyways, this is why basically every Air Force heavily invests in the bomber, and that includes the Germans. I mean, consider this. The bomber force was always the largest proportion of all major Luftwaffe campaigns from 1939 to 1941 and even beyond. For Poland, France, and Operation Barbarossa, it always accounts for about 40% of the Luftwaffe's operational strength. And the Luftwaffe knows that countries like France or the United Kingdom are also building up a large bomber fleet. And naturally, that is exactly what brings us to the question of countermeasures, which brings us then to technology, right? How do you tackle the bomber? How do you protect yourself from this onslaught of area firepower that can strike seemingly where it wants, when it wants? Well, the Luftwaffe wrestled with these questions as everybody else did. And anti-aircraft artillery, or Flugabwehrkanonen, the famous flak, was one way. And it is no surprise that the Germans heavily invested into flak as point defense. During World War II, Germany fielded a very impressive amount of fireworks, which Allied bombers had to punch through in order to get to the target. If you've ever seen, well, Masters of the Skies recently, or Memphis Belle a long time ago, you will know what I'm talking about. But flak has limits. It can only be fielded in close proximity to the target. It requires a lot of personnel and material. It is fixed, and it only has a few minutes to fire before a bomber actually leaves its effective range. And yeah, flak is a point defense, but ideally you want to hit bombers before they even get close to the target. So, and you know what's coming now, the Germans start to develop the fight. No, they don't. They don't develop the fighter. They developed the Zerstörer, a twin-engine high-performance heavy fighter to knock out bombers at range before they get to the target. The Zerstörer was to have heavy firepower, range, and be easier to navigate with the inclusion of a second crewman and radio directional finding. You may be asking now, what about the fighter then? The fighter was a plane that had a lot of limitations during the interwar years. The main ones were range, speed, and firepower. Fighters, well, they had limited endurance. This limits their employment to a small area. And while they were speedy designs that were coming in, for much of the interwar years, this was tempered by virtue of being, well, biplanes. Fighters did not have a performance advantage over bombers yet, severely limiting their operational options and tactical options for interceptions and engagements. And when the fighter finally has a bomber in sight, well, it is limited to mainly 2, and well, if the pilot is lucky on some of the newer machines, 4 low-caliber machine guns, and quite frankly, they don't do much. While the bomber usually has sufficient defensive firepower to get out of a scrap, especially because it was also much faster. Basically, every single obvious technological drive in the interwar years was for the bomber. Radio communication, navigational tools, construction for structural integrity and weight, payloads, engine performance for speed, life support for crews at high altitude. This was where innovation was centered and technological advancements took place. It was for the bomber. The imbalance to fighters is one we see in full swing during the Spanish Civil War. At the time, modern bombers like the Italian SM-79 were a full generational step ahead of most fighters, actually all fighters. And let's talk about that plane for a second, the SM-79, just to mix it up from the Luftwaffe stuff. The SM-79 was a fast bomber for the time. The Italians don't get enough credit for this aircraft. A max speed of about 430 kilometers an hour. That is with a bomb load, mind you, is very respectable for 1936, 1937. And this SM-79, or Spavero as it was known, would cruise at about 370 kilometers an hour. That's a high cruise setting, but still. That was faster than fighters. And even high-performance biplanes like the Soviet Polikarpov I-15 or the British Gloster Gladiator, they struggle to hit 400 kilometers in a straight line. And then you have the Italian SR41, one of my favorite biplanes of all time, which could hit like 430, 440 kilometers an hour. But that still has its work cut out for it if it wants to catch the SM-79, never mind shoot it down. I think this is something that is very important to remember because we often laugh about a bomber-centric view. But it took a design revolution in fighters to make them a credible threat to bombers. The early high-performance fighters you know so well, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Supermarine Spitfire, the Curtiss P40, the Mitsubishi A6M, they were just coming out of the prototype stage during the mid to late 1930s. But I am in danger of slipping off course here in this episode. I want to explain what the Germans wanted the fighter to do, even considering that it was not the focal point for the Luftwaffe. And to paraphrase the clickbaity nonsense floating around in the ether of the internet, the answer may surprise you. The Germans wanted the fighter for close air support. Now that there have been a number of violent human keyboard interfaces, let me explain. What I said there was primarily a play on words to get your attention back at this critical point in the video. It's not close air support the way we think of today with fighter bombers. Although in 1940 the Bf 109E was first introduced into the only Luftwaffe close air support unit flying Henschel 123s at the time, but that's not it. It's not the close air support we think of, and it's definitely not the close air support you know from the A-10 Thunderbird. No, not close air support in terms of specific mission roles, but more in the sense of operational level support to the army. I addressed it in a recent episode answering a community question by supporter Stahlfaust. The Luftwaffe has two different operational level support concepts, unmittelbare and mittelbare Unterstützung. I tend to go with a plain English translation of indirect and direct air support. Now, direct air support is not close air support. Close air support is, however, a part of direct air support, or became one. And what planes are meant to conduct direct air support? Well, here's a direct quote from the Luftwaffe doctrine. Open quote, working directly with the army is primarily the task of those parts of the Luftwaffe that are assigned to and subordinate to the army for reconnaissance and air defense. These include reconnaissance, air defenses, and fighters. End quote. Booyah! And then let's consider the fighter as per the main publication of the Luftwaffe staff colleges. The fighter was to, open quote, combat enemy fighter forces in the operational area to gain air superiority over a limited area for a limited time. Fighters are also responsible for protecting ground troops against enemy air attacks, keeping enemy air reconnaissance at bay, and protecting friendly air reconnaissance. End quote. Have I ever told you how much I love primary sources and archives? It's just so nice to learn about all the stuff that created the actual planes and connecting the dots and the concepts and coming to surprising but really satisfying conclusions. Anyway, as you can see, for the Luftwaffe, the fighter aircraft is primarily a tool to secure air superiority in a given operational area to support the army, the Heer. It's not an aircraft to tackle the bomber. That is not, and that is, I'm going to repeat it, that is not to say that the Luftwaffe didn't consider using fighters against bombers in homeland defense. But that was, at least in doctrine, a secondary role. Remember, an air war is not won by sitting at home and being defensive. Air power is about offense, which is why the Luftwaffe wanted to proactively destroy any other air force with a swift opening strike using bombers and heavy fighters. Now that I have lined out the doctrine, it is time to evaluate the importance of this. Remember, this is reflective of how the Luftwaffe and the Germans really wanted to fight. The sources clearly demonstrate that the Luftwaffe's focus is to tie the fighter aircraft to the operational movements of the army. That makes a lot of sense if we look at how Germany plans its campaigns. Germany wants fast, decisive actions, brought forth by a tight integration and concentration of mechanized and armored units that punch through the adversary and then race forward while the remaining force funnels its way through the breakthrough, enlarges it, and keeps fueling that momentum. After all, every country really wants to have a fast and decisive victory. Nobody really plans for a long war. Of course, you can't do that if your fast and elite units end up being stopped or the follow-up echelon and reinforcements get destroyed. for example by Allied air power. If the enemy starts bombing frontline troops or stockpiles at the divisional or corps level, then suddenly an advance isn't as swift as the propaganda cameras would like to see. So, to protect the advance, a new generation of fast maneuverable fighters was needed. They have the necessary agility and firepower to tackle enemy fighters, bombers and recon aircraft to establish temporary air superiority over a critical operational area. That protects the ground forces and the reconnaissance planes. And that is just enough for the Germans. And thus, drumroll, you have the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Fast, with a strong climb, good dive, respectable firepower, optimized for dogfights. The low range of the Bf 109? Yes, it's a problem in the Battle of Britain. But Germany plans to have a continental campaign first, then worry about Britain. In fact, it had hoped that it could keep Britain neutral to about 1941, 1942. That's an interesting story, by the way, for another episodes, because then suddenly, the German strategic bomber program starts to make sense. Oh wait, channel supporters already have access to an episode about that. It's almost like I know what I'm doing. Okay, serious now. To the matter at hand. On the European continent, everything is in easy flying distance, which is part of the reason, not the full reason, but part of the reason, why all the other European nations don't stress range in fighters. And where range becomes an issue on the operational level, force design comes into play. Luftwaffe fighter units were afforded their own technical and logistic support units that could make even a rudimentary airstrip into a working temporary airbase. This way, the Luftwaffe fighters could fly multiple sorties a day from shorter distances, outflying other air forces. That allowed the fighters to maintain a level of air superiority that then also helped aircraft like the Ju-87 to attack targets in closer proximity to the front lines. As a result, Luftwaffe fighter units could hop and hop by leaps and bounds with the army, concentrating fighter mass and protect the army from strikes. A good example is the crossing of the Meuse in 1940, when it became obvious that the panzers were going full tilt up that favorite German highway into France at Sedan. British and French aircraft mounted a desperate attempt to destroy a key pontoon bridge, something that was foiled by strong German fighter cover and point defense flak. Here, the German emphasis on concentrating fighters and air defense at a decisive time and space helped secure its victory at Sedan, something the Allies did not do at this time. And the second advantage here is establishing air superiority helps with something else. Something that I mentioned previously, but I will now emphasize it as it is easily forgotten even though it is so critical in warfare. Reconnaissance. Ever since the Battle of Verdun in 1916, air warfare was intrinsically linked to emptying the sky of enemy fighters in order to send out vulnerable but critical reconnaissance aircraft to generate data on enemy positions and troop movements. Now, if you mass fighters in one area and deny that space at a critical time to enemy reconnaissance, they don't know what you are up to, where you are massing and maneuvering your forces, when the attack is going to take place, and where you are vulnerable. On the flip side, friendly reconnaissance can act without being shot down, and you will know far more about troop dispositions, and thus you can act and plan accordingly. Given this, the Luftwaffe's doctrine, force architecture and design choices and trade-offs for fighters make sense from the German perspective. This was one part of how the Luftwaffe and the German armed forces wanted to fight and win its campaigns. And, to loop back to what I said earlier, this lesson, yes, it appears self-evident even in 1916, but it isn't. Take the British or the French. They had good fighter forces in 1940 during the German attack on France and the Low Countries. Give and take in the margins, but nothing to condemn a force from the start, even with the French. But neither managed to mass their fighters consistently to cover decisive ground maneuvers as part of joint operations. They only did it when it was too late. Arguably, the first real example of the Allies doing this is when desperation sets in and Spitfires are sent to cover the evacuation at Dunkirk. It's a lesson the Allies then learn quickly, and by the end of the war, in that classic switcheroo, they do it far better than the Luftwaffe. But at this early stage, the self-evidence of hindsight should not fool us. The obvious is only obvious once it is shown to be obvious. And now you know all the fundamentals for the German fighters of World War II. And from now on, we can go into all the other rabbit holes. Remember to check out Rec Watches and the Habu SR71 edition for an absolutely unique air power inspired watch. Join me next time on The Luftwaffe at War as we dive deeper into the Luftwaffe's operations, aircraft and thinking during World War II. The show is written and produced by me, Christoph Bergs, and if you want to get a hold of future episodes early, vote on topics and get priority access to Q&As, become a supporter of The Luftwaffe at War at patreon.com/milAvHistory or via YouTube memberships on Military Aviation History. A big thank you goes to all the supporters for making this possible. As always, thank you for joining me today and have a great day and see you in the sky.